Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today in the kitchen, we are making beef stock, also known as beef broth, also sometimes known as bone broth. And if you are looking for tested, approved recipes for this kind of broth, it will be called one of those three things, and sometimes they only list it under one of those three things. So sometimes you have to look under stock instead of broth. Sometimes you have to look under broth. Sometimes there is something listed for bone broth. It can be really frustrating to actually try to find an approved recipe. But what I'm mostly here to tell you today is this is not complicated. It's pretty much safe almost no matter what you do, because it's a very thin liquid that's being pressure canned at a very high temperature for 25, I think, minutes, 20 to 25 minutes, depending on whether it's pints or quarts. And what you put in there isn't going to have a huge impact on it, because you're going to be filtering out everything that you cook that stock down with. So if you're adding carrots and you're adding celery, you're adding some spices, all of that's going to get sifted back out, and so that you've just got a liquid broth at the end. And that is going to give you something thin enough that you don't have to worry too much about processing times being substantially messed up in terms of safety, simply because you decided to add a carrot to the mix and the original recipe didn't call for a carrot. So this recipe that I'm using is based on the tested recipes in the Ball Canning books and on the National Center for Home Food Preservation website, but it's also based on a recipe that's online from Serious Eats. And that was a recipe that you were just making beef stock to cook with. It's not actually a canning recipe, and so it includes a little bit of tomato paste for added flavor, and I decided to go ahead and add that to my recipe. So bone broth, a lovely thing to have on your shelf, either for just sipping or for adding to all kinds of soups and stews and things like that. So it's a wonderful shelf-stable product and a great way to clean out a lot of big chunks of bony meat in your freezer. Let's get started.
So these are soup bones, and because of that, there's quite a bit of meat on these, and I ended up trimming off a lot of that meat and just making a stew, because I didn't think I needed quite this much meat for just a beef broth. The general rule of thumb is it takes about a pound of bones and some meat in order to make about a pint of beef stock. So if you want to have a good flavored beef stock, that's about the ratio you need to go for. I did include a couple of short ribs here that I just decided I was never going to get around to fiddling with in any other way. So I had almost 6 pounds of meat before I started cutting the meat off the bones here. I generously trimmed these. This is after they've been trimmed. I'm coating everything with a very light coating of avocado oil. You could also use olive oil. And the reason for that is that heat will transfer to this meat way better when it's coated with oil than when it's just the air of the oven. And therefore, we're going to get better browning, and that browning is going to be better flavor. What I'm doing is putting these all on a nice cookie sheet with some parchment paper underneath, and I'm going to roast these in my oven for a total of about an hour. And this is pretty typical when making a beef stock, is you want to roast those bones to get what's called the Maillard reaction, which is some browning that creates all kinds of different flavor compounds that are much more complex than if you just threw these into a pot with some water. So this is a half an hour in, and I'm adding a chopped stalk of celery, some carrot, and some onion to this mix, and then letting it roast for another half an hour. And you notice my vegetables are really chunky here, because they're going to get cooked down in the liquid for a very long time, and so I don't really need to chop them up very much, which is nice. So another 30 minutes in the oven. And you can see I've got some really nice browning on here. You might notice no salt in this, so we haven't added any salt. Notice how those bones are cross-cut so that that marrow is exposed. That is going to give you a much richer broth, a much better flavor, and lots more nutrition than if you just had big, long bones. I've done different versions of beef stock over the years, and sometimes I've got big chunks of bone, and sometimes I've got cross cuts like I did here. So everything's going into a nice big stock pot here. If you had a roaster pan, you could also use that. And if you had a smaller amount, you could do this in your Instant Pot instead of on the stove. I chose to do this on the stove because I had a little over 4 pounds of bones and meat here, and it was too much for my Instant Pot. So I'm going to top that off until water is actually covering all of the meat. I was doing kettles of hot water, and so while the second kettle was heating, I'm adding in a couple tablespoons of homemade tomato paste, some parsley, some dried parsley. You can use fresh if you've got it, and then a little bit of thyme as well. And I think I threw a bay leaf in here in addition. I can't remember for sure. Spices in here, completely optional. Tomato paste, definitely optional. It's got a very rich umami flavor, and so I was just trying to accentuate that. But you can leave it out if it makes you uncomfortable in terms of if you're worried about the safety, or if you just simply don't want tomato flavor in your beef stock, that's completely fine. So got this going, let it simmer, and I simmered this all day and then turned it off and let it sit on the stove and then turned it back on and simmered it for another 4 or 5 hours. So this was probably, I would say, close to 12 hours of simmering here. I did not add any apple cider vinegar, and that's common if you're making bone broth because it's believed that the acid will help pull out some of those additional minerals. I'm not really sure the science holds up on that, and by adding the tomato paste, I'm still adding an acid, and so I just opted for that instead. I'm straining out the big chunky bits here, and my dogs really enjoyed having bones to chew on for the next couple of days. And this took 2 strains. So this was the first one, and then I couldn't get it all in the pot, and so there's a second one coming. And then here's what's left in that pot, which includes a lot of the meat. This meat has really given up its flavor. You can eat this, and I did snack on some of it, just throwing a little bit of salt on it and snacking on it. But most of that flavor has been released into the broth, and that's what you're going for. So don't feel like that's gone to waste if you don't do something with it, because it's given up all of its flavor. I'm rinsing my pot with a little bit of extra water just to get as much out of here as I possibly can, because at this point I've got, 12 hours of work into this, so it's pretty precious. And then here is our leftover meat and bones. And then here's our stock. And what I did is, because it's cold right now, I just set that on my back porch and let it sit overnight so that the fat that was in there would rise to the top and I could scrape it off. I don't want all of that fat in my jars. You can it with the fat, but the problem is the fat, if it sits long enough, can eventually go rancid. And just in general, I want a beef stock that is just pure beef and not a lot of fat. You can see the color of that fat, partly because there was some grass-finished beef in there, and so I'm sure that's partly because of the grass-finished quality of the beef, but also that tomato paste is obviously coloring things. So because everything is nice and cold, I'm able to just scrape off that very slowly, but scrape off the tallow at this point that is on this. You could use this for something if you wanted to, but there's a lot of flavor in there, and it would take a lot of work to purify it to where it didn't taste like tomato and other things, and so I just fed it to the dogs. And see how gelatinous that is? That's what you're looking for. That means that you've actually released a lot of the collagen and minerals that were in those bones. I have a total here of 4 pounds, 11 ounces. A pint is a pound, and so I know I've got almost 5 pints of juice. I heated it up, put it through a finer mesh strainer, and then heated it to boiling. So I'm trying to get as much of that tomato paste out of there as I can. I did put a little bit of salt in my jars. It's interesting, none of the recipes really call for adding salt, but they do for chicken stock. And I was like, why wouldn't you add some salt? You want that flavor in there. And so I did a 1/4 teaspoon of salt per pint. And then because I wasn't exactly sure how much I was gonna have, and I knew I was gonna thin it out a little bit with water to finish the jars, I kind of skipped from jar to jar to jar here just to make sure that I was getting an even amount of beef stock in each one of these jars. And there is a little bit of fat still in this stock because some of that fat has simply kind of emulsified into the broth itself. And you'll see in the finished jars, there's a little bit of fat floating around in there. It's not gonna hurt anything, but I didn't want 1/4 inch topping of fat on these jars. You might want that. And if you're gonna use it fairly quickly, go for it. It's not gonna hurt anything. Once I get down to the bottom of the pot, I just decided to do this without a ladle because I was getting pretty close here. And I'm pretty close. I knew I was going to have close to 5 pints. And then I want 1 inch of headspace, so a lot of headspace on this. And so I'm just topping these up with boiling water in order to get to my 1 inch headspace. Once again, you guys have seen me do this over and over again. Wipe my rims really well, especially because fat is in this stock and it could be greasy. So I really want to make sure I wipe everything well. You can also use a little bit of white vinegar and wipe the rims with vinegar if you feel like you've spilled and there's grease on things. And then I'm being picky today and lining up the lid with the front of the jar just because sometimes I do that. And then these are going to pressure can for 20 minutes. Give it a little bit past finger tight for pressure canning. I think you're less likely to have a lot of siphoning if you do that. So here we are going into the canner. This is a Presto 16 quart canner that I've had for going on 10 years now. We're up to temperature, and this is on a Presto. This is what you want to see, this little rocker. And this is 10 pounds of pressure, but I don't pay any attention to the gauge because my weighted little weight there is 10 pounds. And when that's rocking, it's never going to get past 10 pounds because anything beyond 10 pounds is going to be released. Let it come all the way down naturally to 0 pressure. Take the lid off, let it sit in the canner for 5 to 10 minutes before you take your jars out. That's going to reduce your siphoning and give you a better seal on your jar. These are still quite hot. And there you have it. So 5 pints of beautiful beef broth and a ton of stew, you guys. I made a huge batch of beef stew from about 5 pounds of beef. Let me know if you'd like to can your own chicken, beef, and vegetable stocks in the comments. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.